Afternoon and welcome to our workshop today, SVP Dallas Workshop, Funders and Fundraising. My name is Prisma Garcia and I'm the Director of Capacity Building at SVP Dallas. Today's workshop, we will be having a conversation with some experts in the field, and we will explore fundraising during this pandemic, which is continuous and ongoing. And we will learn how the pandemic has really shifted nonprofits, fundraising, and also the thought process of funders. And we'll hopefully learn how we can build strong relationships with donors and continue to communicate effectively and implement new methods of fundraising as we're approaching the fourth quarter of the year. Today we have some impressive panelists with us here. And I'll just quickly name them off, but we'll hear from them directly. We have SVP partner Lynn Fisher. She's also the Vice President at the Musi Foundation. We have Regina Montoya. She's a philanthropist, CEO and chairperson of Regina T. Montoya PLLC. Tamika Cass, she's a founding member of the Heritage Giving Circle, and also a fundraiser. Ashley Harris, who's a Vice President of Development at the Texas Women's Foundation. And we have SVP partner and DJR alum, Glenn Ayers, here with us today, who's also the Cultural Program Manager at the City of Dallas Office of Arts and Culture. Welcome, panelists, and we will start off today with just some quick introductions. And so we'll let you share a little bit more about yourself. I know that all of you are coming from different parts of different perspectives, and we'll add to this conversation. And welcome to all of our audience members. At any point during this webinar, feel free to post on social media. Feel free to use the hashtag SVPD Workshop, and I will turn it over to our panelists for introduction. I believe, I think we had Lynn Fisher coming up first.
Great. Thanks, Prisma. I'm Director of Philanthropy for the Caroline Rose Hunt family. And in that role, I manage the Rosewood Foundation and the Corporate Matching Program, as well as grant making for the Musi Foundation, a family foundation set up by Mrs. Hunt for her grandchildren. It's named for her grandmother name, Musi. I also advise on the personal giving for a few of the family members. And this October, I celebrate 35 years with Rosewood. My favorite part of my job is being a connector. I try to look for ways to match needs with resources, whether it's collaborating with other funders or bringing nonprofits together to share ideas, best practices, or something as simple as making an introduction between organizations or introducing a nonprofit to a funder. I've been so proud of the philanthropic community here in Dallas and the resilience of nonprofits, many of whom have had to quickly adapt to new and unforeseen circumstances. I'm excited to be here to join the conversation and offer any insights I may have.
Thank you, Lynn. I appreciate that warm welcome. And I'm going to turn it over to Glenn for his intro.
Hi everyone, my name is Glenn Ayers. I am the Cultural Programs Manager for the City of Dallas Office of Arts and Culture. I started with the office back in 2017, and things have been nonstop, it seems, for our office. Back in 2018, very shortly after I started, our office passed a new cultural plan and policy that really guides our work with over 9,000 residents that we engaged in the city of Dallas. And as a funder, we sort of sit in this really interesting in-between from sort of a private foundation and private funder sort of situation, being part of a public entity, but also giving funds to the public. My particular position oversees all of our cultural funding programs. So that includes anything from operational support to project support. We fund both individual artists, which makes us very unique as a giving entity, as well as nonprofit organizations. Oh my gosh, I didn't have all of this scripted as well as Lynn did. Like I said, we've been working and use our cultural plan and policy to help guide us and to find new ways to address what ends up being our top priorities for the city as far as our department goes, which are equity, diversity, support for artists, space, the sustainable arts ecosystem, and communication in general. So I'm really looking forward to our conversations today and any questions that might come up from that.
Thank you, Glenn. No worries. We want to be as authentic as possible. We all don't need to be scripted, but we're going to pass it off to Ashley Harris. And Ashley, I would like to, just thank our partner, Don Hooper, for making the introduction. I know you have a unique perspective coming from the Texas Women's Foundation, so I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Prisma and SVP, for having me speak on behalf of Texas Women's Foundation, where I serve as the Vice President of Development. I can't wait to hear what everyone has to share today. My background, I actually came to fundraising after my first career, 10 years as a litigation paralegal. And I often joke that it's more fun to raise money than it is to fight about it. But the legal field was a great training ground for fundraising. I think litigation taught me to visualize the win and how to build a plan to get there, and how to distill compelling stories from complex facts and data and issues. From this environment, I migrated into fundraising consulting 11 years ago, starting as a project manager in the big capital campaign arena. I've had the privilege to lay the groundwork for big campaigns in San Antonio for the Children's Hospital and the Tobin Center for the Performing Arts. In Dallas, I've led the strategy for successful campaigns for the Notre Dame School, Circle 10 Council, and the Resource Center. We raised a lot of money. We brought the campaigns home, and I got to work with some amazing nonprofit CEOs, like my friend Cece Cox. I have led the development teams at Dallas Area Habitat for Humanity and The Bridge. Both have multi-million-dollar annual funds that I'll talk about later. And getting the call from Texas Women's Foundation in April last year was really the moment of synchronicity for my professional experience and my passion for community building. Leading the fundraising team and helping the foundation fulfill statewide expansion plans, assuming responsibility for an annual fund that is really as big as some of the campaigns I've worked on. My job is a joy because of all the powerful women I work with every day, our volunteers, our staff, and especially my amazing team of fundraisers, Ashley, Jessica, Natalia, Alyssa. You guys inspire me every day. And of course, the Foundation's mission of empowering women's economic security and leadership. There's no better investment than one in a woman. So thank you.
Thank you for that, Ashley. And now we have Regina Montoya, which, we're happy to have Regina. She's coming from, you mentioned, Ashley mentioned being a paralegal and working in the legal field, and Regina is an attorney, and so she could share with us. I know she's done work within fundraising in different areas. So Regina, we'll turn it over to you.
Well, Prisma, first off, thank you so much for the opportunity to be with everyone today. What a delight, and these panelists are just fabulous. And you and your team have just put together a great panel for today. So thank you for this opportunity. And I would like to follow up on some of the comments Ashley made. I've started my career here as an attorney and am working in my own firm, focusing in on healthcare. She mentioned children's hospitals. I was actually the general counsel at our local one here, Children's Medical Center, for a number of years, but before that was with a law firm. But most importantly, I learned very early on, as a result of working for a great federal judge, Judge Sarah T. Hughes, someone that many of you may remember from the history books because she was the one that swore in LBJ on that terrible day in Dallas. But one thing I learned from her, and I learned from others very early on, is how important it is to give back. And when one does give back in the nonprofit area, and I've been engaged with a number of nonprofits in our community for many, many years, part of that having been introduced by various folks at my law firm, it's how important it is to be able to provide a good economic foundation for these organizations. in order to really fulfill the mission of these organizations. In my case, currently I'm on the Arboretum board as the secretary. I also serve on some other national boards that have been involved with girls and women's issues, been very involved with the Texas Women's Foundation at various points. But the key on this is that if one isn't able to provide the financial opportunities for that organization in whatever field it is, you will not be able to achieve your mission. And I learned that early on and how important it is. So I'm looking forward to this conversation today because that's what we owe to the folks here in Dallas. I did serve as the chair of the Mayor's Task Force on Poverty, in Mayor Mike Rawlings' Task Force on Poverty. And we have a lot of challenges in our community, and we need to be there for people to shine that light on what it is. And in my case, I know what was so important. It's getting that American dream. So let's make sure that we can do that for everyone. So again, Prisma, thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Regina. I'm going to pass it on to Tamika, and I know that she's coming from, you know, where we want to hear her perspective about the Giving Circle, but I know she has a lot of fundraising experience herself. So Tamika, take it on.
Thank you. First of all, as Prisma said, my name is Tamika Cass, and I am one of the co-founding or founding members of Heritage Giving Circle, and also currently serve as the Director of Philanthropy at Metro Care Services. And I'm so grateful to be a part of this wonderful panel lineup here today. And just want to share that I've been in the fundraising and development profession for about 20 years now, and have seen a lot of changes that have happened over the years with all of the different strategies. In my current role at Metro Care Services, I'm responsible for the agency-wide fund development strategies as well as special events, all of the organization's grant-making initiatives, volunteer engagement, and other strategic assignments that move the agency forward. And I think everyone would attest that right now, due to the pandemic, MetroCare's mission is to provide access to behavioral health services in Dallas County, which is very much a current need in the community, given the state of our nation. And so I look forward today to talking more in depth about that. Some of the other work that I'm involved in, as I mentioned, Heritage Giving Circle, which I'm honored to be a part of this amazing group of women who pool our resources and finances together to impact local nonprofits and communities that serve people of color and are led by women. And so very excited about that opportunity. Also Power in Action, which is a newly formed initiative where we're focused on impacting African-American communities that are severely impacted by COVID and other traumatic events. I also have served on several boards here in Dallas, Girls Inc. I'm currently the president of the Parent and Student Association Board for St. Philip's School and Community Center. I'm also on the board of Association for Fundraising Professionals, where I serve as their vice president of external affairs. And so I've been in Dallas for a very long time, have a very well scope of knowledge of the nonprofit platform and the current needs. I've also had the honor of working with some of the most dynamic CEOs and nonprofits in Dallas, one being Parkland Health and Hospital System, where I worked at Parkland Foundation, served on the fundraising team that helped build what is now the new Parkland Health and Hospital System. And I've also worked at United Way of Metropolitan Dallas, where I worked on special initiatives and major gift fundraising efforts under the leadership of their wonderful CEO, Jennifer Sampson. Again, I'm happy to be amongst this wonderful group here today and look forward to talking more about fundraising and fundraisers in the midst of a pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamika, and to all of our panelists. And also I wanted to give a special thanks to our sponsors, Something Good Consulting Group and Right Connector PLLC, for their continuous support of these webinars, workshops, and for being supportive of our work in North Texas. We're gonna, the way we want to do this is that we want, to learn from each other, and our Q&A is open for the audience, so you can submit questions as we're having discussion. but we will address those at the end. As a reminder, also, if you want to post on social media, you can do that using the hashtag SVPD Workshop. And we're gonna go into more of a panelist perspective. I know that everyone is coming from different background, a different experience, a different position now. And you know, this is a broad topic intentionally. We know that our audience members have, you know, have different questions and have different needs, and maybe are encountering, you know, maybe they were in the middle of a capital campaign when the pandemic occurred, or now we're planning for Giving Day, and you know, maybe there are some shifts there, or maybe we had a big event that was canceled, and so, you know, we understand that we have a variety of different needs. And so we're going to jump into a deeper dive with our panelists. They're going to go over just a little bit more about, you know, what has shifted and what has changed for them, and how they're viewing it from the funder perspective and also from fundraising. And so what we're going to do is we're going to just go around again, and we're going to kick it off with Ashley this time. And we're going to hear a little bit more. You know, Ashley has a unique role. She's, you know, she's part of the giving, but also in her particular job, she's part of the fundraising. And so I'm going to turn it back over to Ashley for that deeper dive.
Thanks, Prisma. Yeah, so moving into fundraising, I'll talk about how the foundation responded to COVID and offer some thoughts about successful development operations. So the foundation's response to COVID, I would characterize as acceptance, pivoting, and implementation. Our foundation operates more like a nonprofit in that we fundraise 97% of our budget, and we operate programs. We rely on fundraising to fuel our mission, and our annual fund is $8 million for the current fiscal year. So like many of you, what we faced in March was going home, working from home, shuttering a major spring event. We were like everybody else. We were completely unsure about what was coming on a daily basis. So, you know, once that initial shock passed, we sprang into action on every front, and I think it's a reflection of the foundation's leadership and culture. We're innovative, we're dynamic, we're adaptable. As a community foundation, the first thing we did was establish our resilience fund to start responding to the extreme needs to nonprofits, primarily serving women and girls. So the Resilience Fund has supplanted our annual community grant cycle with monthly granting, and as of August, we've put $1 million back into community. So this process is now open to a broader funding audience. If your organization or your program serves 75% women and girls, please check our application on the website. And as Tamika mentioned, the foundation is also a fiscal agent to 4 giving circles, including Heritage, the Village, H100, and Orchid. Their granting is mainly by invitation to organizations that improve the lives of the Black, Hispanic, and Asian Pacific Islander communities in North Texas. So again, check our website for their application guidelines. So I think the critical pivot with the foundation was our decision to go virtual with all of our events and ramp up our programming. Some examples of this: we converted our canceled April event into conversations with our award winners who would have been honored at the dinner. We have produced monthly viewpoints series around education, childcare access, and Black philanthropy. We have hosted weekly presentations of our new research, Economic Issues for Women in Texas 2020, to both individual and corporate groups. All of our meetings, programs, and events are virtual for fiscal year 21. This decision helped us during budget planning and provided clarity for an entire year, knowing that we can always add in-person components as the health and economic conditions improve. And we know after 4 months of all of this virtual programming that we're reaching more people with our events, and we're engaging more people in our mission. So the implementation flowed from acceptance and pivoting. We went through the budgeting process earlier in the spring. We built several budget models and adapted the most conservative one for the year. Our development team had a strategic retreat, and we developed quarterly priorities. So all of our events flow from that plan, and we found it much easier to put things aside for later so that we can stay focused on what is an immediate priority. The fundraising is going very well so far, thanks to our loyal supporters who are passionate about our mission. And I think the fact that we've stayed in constant communication with our donors about how they can help. So, big picture thoughts about successful development operations. I believe that great success in fundraising follows bold vision that's backed by a solid business plan and committed leadership. People want to be part of something that's successful, and they're motivated to invest in solutions. In the COVID environment, I would add that people also really want to help. Funders are asking about due diligence. Be ready to explain what you have done at your nonprofit to get your financial house in order. No matter your mission, fundraising is local. I think it's critical to convey the impact to the community that you're serving to your donors. Have you answered or considered questions about collaboration with other nonprofits in your space? This persistent question is going to stay top of mind with a lot of funders. I would urge you to share your thoughtful and strategic plans. Planning is something that we have to make time for because vision is appealing to donors. In COVID times, I think it is particularly reassuring to leadership that they know and understand the plan that's guiding our work as fundraisers. Don't be afraid to talk about your plans, even if they're in the planning stage. There are great inspirational donor opportunities to share. It's wonderful to be able to ask for guidance and gather wisdom to help refine your own thinking. This is a great place to involve your board of directors individually and as a group. Talk directly to your biggest donors and ask for conversations with funders whose priorities align with your mission. You really may be surprised at how willing a new friend is to help if you have that conversation. And if you don't have a close relationship with your financial team, build one. This is a shout out to you, Don Hooper, our CFO. Understanding your nonprofit's cash flow needs can really help the development team create a timely, focused ask that is aligned with maintaining the budget strength. And so I'll close with some thoughts about end of the year fundraising appeals. North Texas Giving Day is rapidly approaching. It's a huge day for a lot of nonprofits. I've had great success with other agencies spending that day live thanking donors and sending personal messages after the event. This year, end of the year fundraising and appeals are going to be critical to a lot of us. I would suggest that you focus your appeals on how you're meeting critical community needs and how your donors can help. Start planning your end of the year appeal now and get ahead of Thanksgiving, which is very late this year. And if the traditional end of the year appeal at the November-December timeframe doesn't align with your mission, identify a time that does and start planning that appeal now. Remember that.
Oh, Ashley, if we can return to some of those great points, because I know that everyone is interested about the fourth quarter, and I know that we want to pass it on to Tamika, who has also been doing some fundraising herself, but it's also a part of the giving circle that is also at the Texas Women's Foundation. So there's a lot of overlap here. Tamika, if you're ready, we will pass it on to you so that you can tell us a little bit more about the shifts you've seen in fundraising at your own organization, but then, you know, what your experience has been with the Giving Circle, and you mentioned Power in Action and all these other things. So we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Prisma. The friendly reminder to unmute yourself before you start talking. One of the things that I've seen in the shift given COVID is the shift for funders. Many funders, as you all know, have priorities that they're focused on with their grant making funds. The shift has come in funders really being more cognizant and diligent about what they will support, because they understand that fundraising and support from grant-making organizations is critical for social impact organizations at this time. So I think, and want to thank all the funders, especially those on the call, that have been very flexible in pooling their funds together with other funders to create a variation of funds to help nonprofits not only just meet the growing demands of the community, but to also create opportunities, because with COVID, so many new operational needs bubbled up that many organizations did not budget for. As an example, at MetroCare, we immediately evaluated our services and went to remote operations and telehealth, but that also caused an increased need for technology enhancements in order to do that. Right now, MetroCare sees an average of about 18,000 individuals per month at various clinics throughout Dallas County. And so the ability for our more than 900 staff members to go remote was a huge undertaking, and it did require some additional funding support from outside of the agency. And so I'm very grateful for Dallas's philanthropic community stepping up and making those funds available, not only for MetroCare, but for other local nonprofits who also had some of those same issues. As far as the Giving Circle, some of the shifts that I have seen is, and this is more of an opportunity, I think a lot of the Giving Circles or associations and civic organizations really have a deep connection to the local community. And during a pandemic such as COVID, those organizations or those groups, we've been able to respond directly to help some of those smaller organizations who tend to have less access to some of those traditional funding resources. And I think that has been an opportunity and has been critical as well. I think, though, one of the challenges that I've seen with that is the direct impact the pandemic has had. Maybe if you're a part of a giving circle such as Heritage, and you have financial commitments that you've made as part of the circle, if that individual or those individuals have experienced a job loss due to the pandemic, then that could potentially impact the fund's ability to support the needs of the community. And Heritage this year was blessed with an anonymous gift from a donor, which allowed our members who were impacted by the pandemic to continue to give at their same giving levels, so that it did not negatively have an effect on our ability to grant out grants to the community and the nonprofits that we tend to support through our efforts.
Thank you, Tamika. And
You're welcome.
We'll get back to some, I'm sure there's some questions. I know some questions came to mind as you were speaking for myself, but I'm going to turn it over to Glenn. And I know the City of Dallas, you've continued with funding organizations within the arts and culture, but then there have been some other initiatives like Emma Lazarus. There's been other funds popping up in collaboration with community foundations. But Glenn, I won't speak for you. I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Prisma. There's a lot that's been going on. And as you can imagine, the city as a whole is quite a large organization. And I'm very proud of the city in a lot of ways for how quickly we were able to pivot, I suppose is the word of the year. But I mean, truly, I don't know of any other sort of situation where a city entity could could turn the wheel that quickly and start adjusting and adapting to everything, whether it's all of the sort of process and procedure that we go through as staff, or then how we, especially as outward of a facing as a department that we are, change what we do in a system in which we do it to help serve those who are impacted by Corona and COVID, and how we continue to address our main overarching priorities, right? Like equity and diversity, those other priorities that I mentioned earlier, space, especially now, where people can't really gather in large ways that we have before. And how do we address those things? Like I said earlier, one of the most sort of unique things that we do is fund individual artists directly. A lot of nonprofit and foundations don't, especially the other major sort of arts funders that we have here in the city. And so what we see is we're not only that great resource for individual artists, but we recognize how uniquely an individual artist, that one person can go into their community, into their neighborhood, and how much more of a, whether if it's a genuine or a more intimate relationship that they have with that community, to really know what kind of arts and culture services that they want, need, anything like that. So that portion of our function is so important to us, and watching all of our individual artists and our organizations go through such a drastic impact from COVID. We know that our artists, many of whom are self-employed in that way, are impacted even more strongly. And then of course, we're talking about our artists of color who are even more disproportionately impacted by it. And so what we as an office have to do, as a department have to do, is really sort of evaluate what we have at our disposal, and then how we are able to adjust what we do in order to act in a timely manner. So we have our other funding programs that help us address different forms of inequities in the city, whether it's racial equity or a geographic equity, for instance, right? But one of the things we have done is find sort of, I say, a new source of funding. It's been there, but it's from our Arts Endowment Fund. And so we created very quickly, with engagement from the city, from our residents, to create this program that allows us to find artists and organizations whose primary intentions and programmatic focuses are around sort of the Alana diaspora. So, right, for those who don't know, Alana is an acronym for African, Latinx, Asian, Arab, and Native American. And so we're really talking about our artists and organizations who are really focused in those arts and culture programming that's focused around those residents especially, right? And so really it was, as much as we, and it always seems to work out this way, that our artists and our arts organizations always have to find sort of the most innovative ways to continue surviving. And they're doing what I would consider an incredible job, watching them change so quickly to virtual programming, watching them continue to provide services, do more with less, which always seems to be the case with artists and organizations in the arts and culture field. It's truly inspiring. And so what we hope to do is continue to find new ways in our office to continue to address our priorities, but also helping our artists and organizations continue to navigate a system like the city. So, sorry, I'm going through my notes that I had. A lot of this really couldn't be done without our like partners and advocates that we have, right? And so us as the city, and I'm going to continue to talk about sort of this relationship and that we have as sort of this in-between from the public to sort of this city entity, this really large business, if you will. And it's all about our relationships with our partners and how do we connect people. I feel like that's one of the strongest assets that we have as a department, both being so outward facing and then navigating a system like the city. And so it's our partners like council members, commissioners, which are appointees of our council for our Arts and Culture Advisory Commission, our artists and organization leaders overall. Very much, I would say that arts and advocacy go hand in hand. You will never, I feel like, find a situation where that is not the case. And then just our communities and community leaders in general. So when we were creating this program called Culture of Value, we held, I believe, 5 community engagement meetings and worked with these other partners to make sure that we get a hold of our community members, of our residents and our artists, to try to hear what they sort of what they need at the moment and compare that to how we could provide something. And so it's both supporting our artists and supporting the residents of Dallas by providing these services. It's always this balance for us. So I'm gonna pause for a second unless I can keep going.
Well, we'll come back to you, Glenn.
Okay, cool.
We'll turn
Perfect.
it over to Regina, who will speak from a different perspective. And I know, Regina, we know that the majority of funders, you know, are actually individuals, right? Or when we're out there fundraising, individuals are the most giving. And so I'm gonna turn it over to you from your perspective as a philanthropist, as a person who's helped with many events in the city and been the chairwoman of these. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, Prisma, thank you so much for that question and for those observations. And I think also just following up on some things that Glenn just mentioned in his conversation, and part of what he was talking about too is sort of the relationships that people are creating. And maybe that's one of the most difficult aspects that we're seeing right now during COVID, because so many of the times, as many of you who are those that are working with organizations, trying to create relationships with others, you go to events, you're able to target those, you're able to follow up with people and have that interpersonal connection. And we're not being able to do that anymore. And so for individual fundraising, then as you're trying to get your message out, there's some really critical things that we, really probably even have to focus on even more than we did pre-COVID. You probably have heard this many, many times that organizations, those that are funding, want to see the metrics. They want to see, are you really getting what you're saying that you're going to do? Are you going to be able to do that? And more than anything, the funders right now, in my sense, is that they want to maximize the resources that they are able to pull together and distribute, because they are limited resources. And if you heard any of those, you've certainly heard that from Glenn's comments with respect to the arts organizations. They're under so much stress right now, particularly in those that had the kinds of revenue coming in from performances, et cetera. So if anything, there is more and more of that emphasis, as you mentioned, Prisma, on the individuals. And so I think one of the things that I would say, and it's kind of following up on some things that Ashley and Tamika had mentioned too, and that's being the thankful part, being able to show the gratitude to folks and to keep following up. I think one thing right now is that we're sort of all overwhelmed with these kind of Zoom calls. We're overwhelmed with the messaging coming in from different areas, and in so many respects, then it's almost the follow-up that those that are looking for individual contributions need to do. And I think if there was any advice I would give to anyone today, it's just not assume that that first email that you sent was the only email that that particular person received that day, or was the only message they received via Facebook Messenger or LinkedIn. I'm finding that many people are trying now to reach me and others through all of these different channels, and you'll get confused. You won't even remember where you're receiving some of this. So keep follow up, not to worry, and understand that you've got that opportunity. So I think that it's going to be interesting times right now, but relationships are going to be even more important, and it's just figuring out that method.
Thank you, Regina. We're going to turn it over to Lynn. And, when we talk about individual giving, family foundations are also a part of that. And they're also, they're sort of sitting in those two spaces of individuals and foundation giving. And so, Lynn, if you wouldn't mind jumping in now.
Great, thanks, Prisma. So I feel like I'm going to echo what all the panelists have already talked about, but kind of from my perspective. So I really feel like that nonprofits have greater access to funders than ever before. I know that personally, I've been able to schedule up to 3 to 4 meetings a day with either new organizations or with longstanding partners to get an update on how they're reacting to the changes in their sector. A year ago, I wouldn't have scheduled that many in-person meetings or site visits. And I certainly would not have had access to nonprofit board members that I've had recently. So, oh my goodness, reach out to your board members. They want to help you. They want to be invited to stand beside you. So invite them to join you on Zoom calls that you have scheduled with potential funders. It not only gives funders an opportunity to ask questions about the involvement of the board, but your board members are just wanting and looking for a tangible way to help. So reach out to them. That's my big advice for today. This is also a time when you can engage new volunteers. If you have a program model which could expand your reach virtually, whether it's online tutoring, mentoring, or even letter writing to clients who may be isolated during this time, take advantage of this time to expand your volunteer base. I appreciate the advice that Ashley and Virginia just shared on how nonprofits need to craft their story and communicate their mission and results clearly. I thought it might be helpful if I sort of gave you an overview of what I'm looking for when I meet with organizations. So very similar to what Regina just spoke about, I want to know, what have you done internally to manage your operations and find new sources of revenue when many of your earned income models have changed or disappeared completely? I always ask if you're seeking the government assistance opportunities that are available, especially early on, like those PPP loans and et cetera. Additionally, I want to make sure you're aware of the North Texas Cares Group. It's a funder collaborative. It's not a pooled fund, but individual funders that look at a common application. So you just apply in one common application that all the funders have agreed on. The second set of applications are being accepted now through October 2nd, and information can be found on the northtexascares.org website. This is a great opportunity for your application to be seen by funders you may not ordinarily have had access to. Another suggestion is to research the giving circles in your community. Tamika represents one of those on the call, and Ashley mentioned the ones with the Texas Women's Foundation. Your organization may fit a particular niche that they're looking for. And lots of times they're looking for smaller grassroots organizations with deep ties to the community, just like Tamika spoke about. Communities foundations are also another great resource for information about applying for grants, and often have resources to help nonprofits raise awareness and offer support, like our very own North Texas Giving Day, sponsored by the Communities Foundation of Texas. But if your organization is not based in Dallas, research your area. Look for Communities Foundation close to you. I also want to know how you are thinking and as a team, co-creating solutions to respond and adapt to the changing circumstances. You may be aligning your staff to possibly change your service delivery model, or you may be taking a hard look at individual budget items in your budget. And probably my favorite, and I hope that you're doing this, you are reaching out and to other nonprofits in your sector and collaborating and finding ways to share resources and provide services in the best way that meets the needs of the community. Finally, of course, I want to know your greatest need. And I want you to be prepared to communicate that, as Regina suggested, in a way that's easy for me not only to share with my board, but to share with other funders as we ask each other, who's doing it well out there? Which happens a lot. Please remember that especially now, funders are trying their very best to respond and meet with as many organizations as they can and make decisions as quickly as possible. And not every conversation or email will turn into a grant. But that conversation is going to plant a seed and open a door to a relationship. I know for myself, a funding fit may not happen the day of our conversation, but 6 months from now, I may run into a colleague is asking for suggestions for organizations that are funding in that sector, and your name may come up. I may have a trustee ask for organizations to consider in that area of work, and your name may come up. Or I may pass your name on to an organization looking to collaborate. It's all about building relationships. You know, I think that those of us in philanthropy are all just trying to create a legacy of giving to pass on to the next generation. I know that's the intent of the Musi Foundation. And goodness, it makes me think about my favorite Hamilton quote: "A legacy is planting seeds in a garden you may never see." So let's all go plant some seeds.
Thank you, Lynn. That's a beautiful quote, and I'm sure it resonated with many of our audience members today. And of course, I want to remind people that SVP Dallas has also been sort of on the funder side, and we not only do pro bono consulting, but during this time we've started the Impact Entrepreneur Fund, and we are, continuously working with our advisees and investees, which also receive funding. I wanted to remind the audience the Q&A is open, but we're going to have a couple of questions here for our panelists today. And, you can continue to submit those questions and we will get to them soon. So I know we've all talked about the keyword, right? Pivot, and changes we've made during this time. And, I wanted to, just Lynn, I know you talked a little bit about those changes, but what was the number one change you would say you made during this time?
Oh gosh, well, from the very beginning of the COVID-19 crisis, I knew that we needed to move beyond normal grant making in our corporate foundation and look inside our business units to find opportunities for in-kind donations, which we were able to do with donations of face shields and hand sanitizer to the city of Dallas. And then we created a partnership with the Dallas Mavericks just to provide meals to first responders with a donation of our rosewood beef products. For the Family Foundation, it was the flexibility in the board to realize that to get funds quickly into the hands of nonprofits applying to the North Texas Care site, we needed to make an exception to our policy. And so we donated to the United Way's Response and Recovery Fund and trusted in them to deploy the funds. So really flexibility in the board to be able to look beyond our current policy and make some changes that impact what needed to happen on the ground at that moment.
Yeah. And I know that you mentioned the CARES funders group, and I know that it's been all about collaboration. And I want to shift a little bit to Tamika, who I know she's been working with donors, and being a part of a giving circle has also been, I'm sure there have been requests coming in on that front. And so have there been any key differences that you could say, this is not how I would approach someone? Obviously we're all on Zoom, but is there anything else as far as like making those meetings or requests of donors? And I know, Lynn, you touched upon this, so maybe there have been a lot of Zoom calls, but I want to hear from Tamika and see if she notices some key differences with donor engagement.
Yes, Prisma, thank you for that. Obviously, there have been lots of differences due to COVID. I think today, nonprofits are really being forced to utilize the innovative strategies that are available to us to stay connected with our donors. Pre-COVID, of course, face-to-face meetings would always be a preference for a fundraiser or an organization who is looking to steward a donor relationship or cultivate and build new relationships with donors. But with social distancing prohibits and guidelines in place, we're having to rethink those strategies. I think for our organization, we've been at the table, as Lynn said, internally talking about what those creative strategies are, whether that is hosting virtual webinars that we typically would have in-person overviews of for, specific information, or if that's creating videos and information to share with our donor base. I think one of the things that we've been very intentional with at MetroCare is doing exactly what Lynn said she's looking for as a funder, as a grant-making organization, and is really staying connected to our donors, helping them understand our mission, how we are pivoting or shifting our work and the way we do business in light of COVID, and then also looking for creative ways to tell our story and how we're creating change and impacting the individuals that we serve. And then the other piece is also effectively communicating our current needs. And again, I think that's really critical for nonprofits, because today needs look different than they did in December of 2019. And so I think it's imperative for all nonprofits to be really focused on that, because funders are being inundated with requests, and funders have a sincere desire to give. And so helping them understand exactly what your needs are is very, very important.
Yeah, thank you, Tamika. And I wanted to backtrack a little bit. I know that I speak about giving circles, and I'm just making the assumption everyone knows how they work. And so can you tell us a little bit about how your giving circle works?
So Heritage Giving Circle, what we do, we have members who make an annual commitment to pool our funding together. And then there's a grant making process where we accept applications. And I think Ashley mentioned early on in her presentation that the fund is currently being held at the Texas Women's Foundation. And so once the application process is open, you can submit your application as a nonprofit if you meet the criteria. And then from that, there's an internal grants committee that reviews those applications. We do site visits. And this year, obviously, because of COVID-19, those site visits had to be virtually performed, but we were still able to get an in-person look at some of the nonprofits who submitted. And then from that, there's a meetings to weigh the applications and the request. And then there's a whole process of granting those out and notifying those awardees. And often is followed up by events, some type of celebration, check presentation. And again, obviously, all of those things are happening virtually due to the pandemic.
Yeah, thank you for that.
You're welcome.
And you mentioned, Tamika, a little bit about messaging. I know that when I had my fundraiser hat on, I was always told, it doesn't matter, Prisma, you have to create, if it's scary to ask for money, you're not asking them for money, you're asking them for them to join you in your mission, is what I was told repeatedly. So I know that storytelling and narratives are important, in particular during this time, to communicate, well, this was pre-COVID and now this is what's happened, and COVID is ongoing, right?
Right.
And so, I want to ask Regina, and, how can nonprofits, effectively communicate their narrative during this pandemic, and to someone who might be, willing to give them funds or help them, for a fundraising event, what would be the approach?
Well, Prisma, I like the way you framed the way that one is going to do fundraising. And one of the things that I've discovered and I really enjoy in the organizations with whom I'm involved in as a board member, be it the Dallas Education Foundation, which is part of the DISD, or the Arboretum, or the list goes on of some of these organizations, but many of them start with a mission moment. And they let you know what it is that they were able to accomplish. You need to convey that mission moment as well to the funders that you are looking to, because sometimes what I discovered, having been the chair of the Mayor's Task Force on Poverty, is that sometimes we turn into data people. We give all of this information about, unless as an example with the Poverty Task Force, the number of people, half of Dallas earning less than 50,000, or the list goes on about what those numbers are. And sometimes we don't put a face to the issues. We don't put a face to the fact that there are, and we're seeing this now when we see these pictures of people lining up for the North Texas Food Bank, and the lines are a mile long, and we see that, but not always have we conveyed that to the funders as to what it is that these organizations really are doing. And so that's something I would really strongly urge organizations to do, is to put a face on what it is that you're doing. It's more than just numbers. It is a mission that you're trying to accomplish. And so you need to do that in a short elevator speech, and to really explain to people, this is exactly how we are going to make a difference. And I think if anything that I've discovered from organizations during this period of time is that, and funders, is that funders are looking to ensure that their very valuable assets are being put to use in the very best way. And so it's incumbent upon you as that person asking to ensure that you're conveying that to them in a way that they can understand, in a way that they can see it, and in a way that they know that their dollars are going to make a difference. But it's not only just the staff members doing that. I would encourage you to not only create that relationship with the funders, but to have your board members be engaged on this as well. And I think having volunteers who are involved in the whole process makes an even bigger difference when they see that it's not just, you know, folks that are doing this every day, but those that are working there as volunteers making that kind of pitch as well. So it's being concise, it's putting a face to the issue, and it's being able to then show the metrics at the end of the day, how it is that you're making that kind of impact.
Great, thank you, Regina. And I want to turn it over to Ashley. And I know, Ashley, you have been communicating this with donors yourself. And you know, what is that compelling part? What is that? What do you bring to donors? And maybe how can nonprofits message, you know, be unique, right? Because I know that we continue to hear the COVID has impacted my budget and I've lost revenue. So how can you make it compelling and unique?
Well, first, I will just say that Regina is right in every comment she just made. We are well-intentioned but guilty as nonprofit staff members sometimes of wanting to give everybody every detail about what we do and why it's important. I think one of the most successful annual appeals I ever presided over made use of graphics and numbers and very little text. Think about the message that you want to convey and do it in a tweet. What, you know, when you're character limited, right? What is your essential message, and stick with that, you know. And I think Regina's right, keeping a face on it, that picture of people lined up for miles waiting for groceries is far more compelling than a long paragraph with a bunch of numbers and narratives. So I think essentialism in your messaging is critical. And I think whoever said, I think it was Regina again, just know that every single donor you're communicating with is overwhelmed with other messages. So make sure that yours shines.
Yeah, thank you, Ashley. And I know that questions are coming in from the audience, so I want to get to those. But just to continue the conversation, I know that, you know, we know that organizations are serving basic needs, and, you know, a lot of the CARES funders are focused on COVID and those basic needs. But then we have some other organizations that still need to survive, and artists, which Glenn, you know, if you can talk a little bit more about that. What about the groups that aren't addressing these basic needs? You know, how can they share their message or align with what we need to hear now?
Sure. I mean, like I mentioned a little bit earlier, sort of arts and advocacy, or arts and these partnerships sort of go hand in hand. Artists will always, I feel like, and rightfully so, be talking about the essential need for arts and culture in general. And of course, I understand what we're talking about when we're talking about like essential versus non-essential, and all of that gets thrown around, especially in a time like this, right? We need water, we need electricity, things like that, right? And food and all of that. But it's really interesting to watch the hunger of over like sort of arts and culture in general through this time, and how people are able to access that and socialize and be able to find a quality of life, you know, that they had pre-COVID through arts and culture. But then I also think a lot about our artists and organizations who are specifically doing programming that it's arts related, but it's specifically either partnering with a different maybe sort of social justice initiative or another type of like just service, one of those basic needs services, right? And I think of one of our artists who develops bilingual coloring books to help our immigrant population navigate the immigration system and process, right? What a great idea, right? What a great program to implement and help that community that so often faces those barriers. And then on top of that, you add COVID, which is even more, right? Then we're talking about I'm also looking at my notes for this question. So, right, so we see that even though like our art, it all sort of comes down to like this idea of innovation and what our artists and organizations are doing in general, but to provide those services for those communities that are still in need for them. It really, a lot of it does still come down to those partnerships, right? And so while our artists are wanting to get their message across and wanting to, whatever their discipline is, execute that discipline in whatever way, I really find that they are being innovative, and our office is doing the best that we can to find those different partnerships for them to innovate. Right now, we're working on a partnership with the Office of Code, right, to help beautify parking lots in different portions of the city. Libraries, park and recreation, and just like other departments that you would not necessarily think of, finding ways for our artists to move in there and give that different sense of their social justice or equity viewpoint to help really start connecting this sort of like arts and thing, which we hear a lot about in our field, right? That so often arts gets pushed to the side when something like this happens, but in order to keep ourselves relevant, in order to continue that message of like arts and advocacy, that arts and portion helps get that message across. It helps support our artists and organizations, and that whole sort of cultural ecosystem as a whole. Does that help? I think that might answer it.
Yeah, it does. But you sort of touched on it briefly, and I know there was a question from an audience member asking about collaboration. Have you seen artists, being intentional about collaborating with certain groups, and has that helped them maybe secure some funding?
Yeah, absolutely. Or at least if one of like a suggestion that I might even give is, how do you look at your current programming? Because sometimes doing another project means more cost, and that's obviously not something that we would want an organization to have to take on if they're not ready for something like that. And so instead, again, it's this idea of maybe adjusting or looking at your programming, your current program that you're already planning on, and how you might be able to partner with different entities, right? We only have so much money. Some other foundation only has so much money, right? And so how do you partner with someone that may be a little bit non-traditional in a sense, right? Who also has money to give in their way, right? We need to pay to beautify this parking lot. We're doing it already. How do we start to merge and make those partnerships to having like an organization's programming be able to adapt to that, so that their mission is being executed, but so is that other partners, right? And I think in that way, the costs can be sort of managed between the two. And so it's not creating new costs, and they're finding a new and various source of revenue in all of that work.
Yeah, thank you, Glenn. And I want to shift the conversation. I know questions are coming in related to social justice, and I wanted to talk a little bit about that in terms of, we talk about becoming allies, but we want to take it a step further to the action stage. Like, how can nonprofits be very intentional? And this question is going to be for Tamika. How can, these organizations be very intentional about, being allies, but then also the action component with Black and Brown communities during this time? And I know there was a question from an audience member, and I'll also let Regina chime in on this one, related to police data and, how do we tell the story, right? Maybe they're serving primarily Latino children or Black children. And so how do we tell this story, but then not maybe present these communities in a certain light? So Tamika, if you can chime in on that question.
Okay, thank you. Yes, happy to chime in. I believe right now it's really important for nonprofits to understand the evolving needs of the community. I think in order to really be intentional with any partnerships or collaborations, as Glenn mentioned, or create allyships, you have to understand what the needs are. And certainly the needs have shifted given COVID-19. As an example, at MetroCare, we understand that while everyone may not have a mental health diagnosis, COVID-19 has caused a lot of distress, a lot of anxiety, and so we've seen a 20% increase in calls for mental health services at our organization. And I think another way, which Glenn also touched on, that nonprofits can show allyship in action is really to identify the gaps in services and look for opportunities to collaborate and partner with other organizations to help meet the needs of the community while avoiding duplication of services. So I think that's really important. And I know I had mentioned early on about my involvement with Power in Action, and Power in Action really was formed in response to the heightened disparities revealed in Black communities by the COVID-19 pandemic. And so it's a collective unit of community leaders with the goal to make change in Black communities while helping to remove some of those systematic disparities. And we're doing that by leveraging our voices of community partners and bringing awareness to the issues that are impacting those Black communities. Also, making sure that we're a resource by providing helpful information, and then creating a very strong advocacy platform to create some changes at the legislative level. And so hopefully that answers the question you were asking.
Yes, and I know that, Regina, you have some data maybe, or and I know we want to talk. You yourself mentioned about the message, and I know elevator speech is key, right? Having it down. So if you could add a little bit to that, the conversation of bringing data into your elevator speech, and being true to these communities that we're talking about.
Rizma, I think that Tamika mentioned a word and a phrase that is so critically important for nonprofits to be focusing on at this point. It's the systemic aspects of what we're seeing. And we're hearing more about that. It's always been there, but we haven't really dealt with it in a way that sometimes gets to the heart of the issue. One thing that has happened with some of our organizations is that we'll find an issue that is important to us at they take a snapshot of that. And we do a little here, a little there, but we don't connect the dots to be able to really create a systemic and systematic approach to a problem. And one of those issues came up when we were working on the Mayor Mike Rawlings task force on poverty. And that was that, Dallas is a quarter foreign born. Glenn was mentioning about the coloring book that we're doing. Well, 43% of Dallas speaks another language other than English at home. Texas has the largest uninsured rates. There are a lot of systemic issues that we have not really put our arms around, and we're only just doing that now. And so it is really important that, because these dollars are scarce, that one can really articulate to funders how it is that you're systematically and systemically approaching an issue, and that you're not just another organization that is just taking a little bite of something and trying to deal with it. Because if you do that, you're going to end up in a very small, segment that is going to probably find itself having a difficulty trying to raise money because it's so very small and not actually being able to make a difference. You're not really being able to scale. So I think that when you're thinking about how you're going to create that elevator speech, you also kind of have to think through how it is that you're part of the big picture, and that how you're going to be able to scale and actually make a difference. Particularly when we're seeing in this COVID period of time, if you're only able to help 10 or 15 or 20, maybe a year ago, that would have been fine. But right now, that's just not going to make a big enough impact. So you've got to think about impact. You've got to think of scalability. Some of the data that you're talking about, if there was anything that I would say to the funders right now, it is that if we could help the nonprofits get the kind of information and data that they need, that would, and for the community, because what you want to be sure is that you're not trying to deal with the situation on an anecdotal basis, that you're actually getting to the heart of the problem. And we don't have that. There's a dearth of that kind of information. We have a little information here, a little information there, but we don't bring it together. So if I could make that kind of plea, it would be, how do we help these nonprofits ensure that they're doing that?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. And I know we're still taking questions from the audience, and we'll continue to do that. And I've been blending these questions, making sure we get to all of them. And so I want to ask Ashley a question related to, we know that we've talked primarily about how organizations can communicate to donors or potential funders out there, but I know that donors also have expectations, and I don't know if those have changed, if it's like, maybe it's COVID is such a situation, and maybe it's they aren't as demanding of data, or maybe it's increased. So Ashley, if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I'll kind of put it in the context maybe of events. I think that number one, being super transparent with your donors is critical. And in this time and all times, I think that for us, we have our luncheon coming up, and I think the way we have approached this and been successful with donors is talking about how we've changed the model, how we've changed the event, and why it's important to us. And so I think that, just being able to talk about what we need and how we're going about achieving that, and how the donor can help us get there has been very successful. And also just being considerate of donors. I feel like people really want to help in this moment. I think that we have all seen that with the North Texas Cares and the Resilience Fund donations that have come in. But I think as fundraisers, we just need to be considerate of our donors. The economic landscape has changed for everybody. And, I was on a call with a board director one day who was having to let staff go. So I think just keeping in mind that when we have a conversation with the donor, sometimes it's a stewardship opportunity instead of putting ourselves first.
Yeah, thank you for that, Ashley. And it brings me to another important question. I know that we've had some organizations that have had to furlough staff, and we've seen changes in staffing for fundraising, and then we have the organizations that were just about to maybe hire their first director of development, and then they're like, should I do this now? Because now I'm worried, right? I'm worried about my funding sources. And so I don't know if Lynn, if you've said you've had all these multiple meetings and you've gotten to meet more people now that you're virtual, but do you have any recommendations for organizations that maybe were considering hiring a director of development during this time? Is that still a good idea? What about just the development staff at organizations, and what your interactions are with them now?
Sure. So the decision to hire a full-time fundraising professional is not simply just a dollars and cents issue, right? The organization needs to be fully prepared to take the next step. They shouldn't have a strong strategic plan. And the bigger issue is making sure that the board is fully engaged, that the board doesn't see this position as, oh, that's a staff thing. Oh, fundraising is just all staff. The board needs to be fully engaged, that that's part of their responsibility as well. And then another key to remember is that too often an organization will add a development professional, but then fail to support that person with the tools they need, either technology or marketing materials, collateral materials. So budgeting for those items are critical as well. And sometimes it's just as simple as maybe taking an inventory of your current staff. And maybe there's someone internally that could step up and take over some of the development duties until you feel like you've got the budget money in place to fund it full time. So lots of things to consider.
Thank you, Lynn. And that brings me to some of these questions that are being asked about fundraising trends, and just opportunities and new challenges. So turning it back over to Regina and Tamika, maybe what are some opportunities and challenges the pandemic has created? Maybe there's some non-traditional funding sources. I think we all you know, we think about the big foundation, but maybe that's not where we need to be looking.
Thanks, Prisma. Regina, did you want to go first, or you want me to go?
Go ahead, Tamika, and I'll follow up. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, thank you. I think Prisma, and I certainly believe that right now the pandemic has forced many nonprofits to evaluate their current fundraising strategies. But in true form, foundations as well as nonprofit organizations should be doing that on a very consistent basis. When a major event like COVID-19 occurs, as we've heard on the call, most grant-making organizations shift their funding priorities in an effort to address the needs of the community. I think the opportunity comes from, with the shift, nonprofits need to ensure that they have a diversification of funding at their organizations. I believe that looking at those and identifying where the opportunities are is very important. As an example, if your organization is heavily funded by private foundations such as Rosewood Foundation, Hillcrest Foundation, places like that, there are opportunities for you to explore other funding streams by really looking at your individuals who contribute on a consistent basis to your organization and developing tools and strategies to engage them, to maybe bring them to more of a consistent giver, possibly at a higher level. There are also some, like as you mentioned and we've talked about before, some of those non-traditional funding opportunities, whether it's giving circles, civic organizations like Junior League of Dallas, if you don't get money from them currently, and others. I think there's also an opportunity for grant writing skills. If you have that with the government, there are also opportunities. I know a lot of nonprofits tend to shy away from those because they can be very large and complex. But at the same time, they can afford nonprofits a substantial amount of funding to help sustain or create new programs or opportunities that they may not have had before. I agree with Regina and Lynn earlier in saying that once these opportunities are realized, that the next step does involve developing a plan to engage, connect, and cultivate those individuals or entities. And the most important piece of that is this framework is key, and that it must involve your board, key staff, and volunteer leadership. Very important piece of the puzzle.
Prisma, I'll follow up then on what Tamika was just saying, and to your question that you had posed earlier. One thing that as I've been scrolling, sort of seeing some of the questions and answers, these have been terrific questions that I know you're going to be getting to, but I do notice a thread that has come through, and that is about racial equity and also social justice. And I want to approach this also even from each organization's perspective. You know, recognizing Dallas has been a majority minority city for decades now. 42% of Dallas is Hispanic, 23% of Dallas is African American. So if your programming is not really reflective of what this city looks like, you're never going to be able to deal with the issues of racial equity and the fact that we have to bring them up as social justice and racial equity. And are you doing that in your organization? Well, that should be part and parcel of your entire mission, because that's who Dallas is. It's a city that's been majority minority, a quarter foreign born. You know, I mentioned some of those numbers before. I would also really encourage you then, as you're thinking about the new funding sources, to think about some of the individual giving, and do you have a diverse board? Are you sure that you're really dealing with the issues that your organization is really involved with right now? And are you getting, you know, sometimes we call ourselves getting into a bubble, where we see that right now in the sports thing. That's kind of a thing, they're keeping it very, you know, close to the vest for everybody in a bubble. And so you want to be sure that you're not ever in your own organization living in a bubble, that you're seeing the full spectrum of issues. So that would be another area. And I think it's also a funding opportunity too. I mean, we talked about the giving circles, but it's also important in your own organizations to have that broad kind of board that may go into other avenues that you've not thought about before because you haven't been exposed to them. So the more diverse your board is, the more that you're able to get that information, I think also gives you an opportunity. So it is, I would look at it as a real opportunity at this point.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I know that, you know, I want to ask Glenn a question from the audience. And on that same note, I know the city of Dallas has really been thinking that way. I mean, recently, and for our audience members who don't know, the city of Dallas has an eviction assistance RFP out for organizations that are seeking, that are work with legal services. So that's out and, you know, open. And then there's also the Emma Lazarus Fund, which, you know, is working with immigrants, you know, and sort of, you know, through the Communities Foundation of Texas, addressing that need that we have in our city now. And I think, Regina, you mentioned the foreign born, right? And so I want to ask Glenn this, you know, question from the audience. You know, first of all, you know, the audience really is happy to hear about artists and what they've been doing during this time. But what is the #1 knowledge need for these arts organizations right now? I mean, the arts are so important, but I think when we start to think about, well, we need food, we need shelter, we need all of these things, but what is that knowledge need for these organizations? Being, you know, is it sustainability, event management? You know, if you could talk a little bit about that, Glenn.
Sure. And again, this is sort of going to be coming from my like realm of being in the city in general, but what I see our partners doing in general, and things where I find that there might be sort of room for maybe flexibility. I really think adaptability is key. Well, I have always seen, and it seems to be a pattern, that our smaller organizations with less overhead are able to change course really relatively well and quickly. It's when we get into those, what I would consider a mid-sized organization that's big enough to have a significant overhead, but not so big, right, that they have the endowment or the money to help them absorb, you know, the losses of a time that we're in right now. And so I think a lot of those are just reassessing where your expenses are, but then also, I think Lynn mentioned earlier, right, those PPP loans and grants, and sort of looking at where there is like money coming from other sources. I think diversifying funding sources in general always makes for a much healthier organization. Whether that's, again, I think about our organizations and artists that are receiving funding from us, you know, we have sort of our other major arts funders, specifically for organizations, to where, you know, it helps give them multiple sources of funding. So if, usually, like if one entity doesn't give funding for that particular year, you know, there are others to have, and hopefully we can provide a resource to help them navigate that system in general. But again, and I think it's finding ways to, you know, find savings in those partnerships as well, like I mentioned before. I think that another thing that organizations can do, especially their leaders, when I was talking about, you know, those partners that we as you know, city staff try to maintain and continue to cultivate, it's the same thing for our, you know, organization leaders and their boards as well. We talk about boards doing fundraising, but I think it lends itself into the advocacy for the arts as well, right? So I can give an example that, you know, the city too, right, is suffering budgetarily. And so everyone is making cuts here and there in ways that we can. And so we saw a very large sort of movement come forward to our city council, who's making these really, really tough decisions for the city. And so we had our advocates for arts and culture in the city come forward and say, you know, we would really like to see, you know, the Office of Arts and Culture, you know, not be cut as drastically, or whatever that might look like, right? And so having those arts organizations know sort of what that funding landscape looks like, and know the kind of power that they have as someone in Dallas, and going to those elected officials and going to those representatives and saying like, no, like we really, really still do matter in this time, right? People need this kind of engagement in arts and culture. And so I think as an organization works on its own sustainability financially, it's also understanding that they do have, hopefully, they have that power, and I hope that they give themselves that agency to advocate for themselves and for the community at large, and be sort of that catalyst a lot of that really helps. I hope that answers.
Yeah, thank you, Glenn. You know, and then, you know, just with that, I know that, you know, through your program, the program at the Office of Arts and Culture, there's a focus on racial equity. And we have a question here, and, you know, any of our panelists, feel free to chime in. I know, Glenn, you might have something to add, maybe Lynn, Ashley, you know, related to racial equity. And I think, you know, our fund, you know, what are the funding policies? What are, you know, what foundations are they being explicit in saying, you know, we need your organization to be thinking through this lens? I touched on it and how important it is for someone who, you know, in the city of Dallas, within, you know, North Texas, but, you know, how important is racial equity when you're looking at a funding proposal? And this is just, you know, Ashley, if you want to take answer, or Glenn, from your perspective, Lynn.
Well, I will just say that the foundation has obviously always looked at gender because that's who we are. We're the Women's Foundation, but I think that the racial piece is also extremely important. We look at those demographics, and I think a lot of funders have kind of honed in on the fact that that diversity makes for a better organization, period, right? And I think that a lot of us look at not only the population that is served by an organization, but how it's led. You know, are there people of color who are in the executive roles, and what does your board look like? I think that's become important to all of us. We certainly do look at that.
Glenn, anything to add there, or Regina?
I think those are great points, and absolutely. I mean, again, we're living in one of the most diverse cities in America, and so it's important that we are able to ensure that every member of our community is being served in the best way. And the threads of racial equity and social justice should go through all of the organizations that we have that are serving people in our community, because that is our community.
Yeah, thank you. I think with that, you know, I know we only have a few minutes left, and, you know, the audience has been asking specific to events. And Regina, I know you've been a part of some events that have completely changed. What happens to these events? Like, what should organizations be thinking? Like, should they reinvent the whole event? How should they go about that?
I literally was just on one just before this that was a luncheon that is held annually. It's actually in Austin. And you know what? In some respects, it was a Zoom event now. In some respects, they were able to actually broaden their opportunities. It was Every Texan. It's a Texas-based organization, but in Austin. I think this time they were able to now broaden it to really people all throughout the state that could attend that event. And so it was really well done, dynamic, and I think other organizations have that opportunity to do that as well. Your overhead is a much lower, and you know, it's going to be a lot of work to do, but just as you can see in our event today, you have great tech people who have made this just seamlessly perfect. And I think we're going to be doing this for a while. So, you know, Glenn mentioned adaptability. We're going to have to be doing that on the fundraising side, but you know, I don't know how we're going to work on the arts organizations for the performance side of it, but I'm sure we're going to be able to adapt. So yes, I would really encourage people to continue doing their events. They're just going to have to think of them a little bit differently, and maybe the good part of that is you can do some national things. You know, I think that I was thinking of Lynn when she was mentioning the Hamilton quote. I was actually on a Zoom about 2 weeks ago with Lin-Manuel Miranda, who now has gotten engaged with different organizations to do that. And I wouldn't have been able to do that but for the Zoom age. So that's an opportunity.
Well, thank you, Regina. Any final words for our panelists before we have to close out? I know we're approaching our time.
I will just say, I'm going to put a plug in because of the arts. So when we're talking about all of this adaptability and all of this, it's incredible to watch our arts organizations and artists like on the cusp of like people starting to like venture out again, right? start to find that adaptability into performing. I encourage everyone, people are posting on artandseek.com for like different events. Our Facebook page is throwing out lots of things that are going on. That's facebook.com/Dallas Culture. But I mean, things are happening and they're starting now. I think the drive-in like movie situation is going to be all back in the rage, right? So there's already been sort of drive-in performance that happened about a month ago by Prison Movement Theater. Bruce Wood Dance just did a sort of a drive-in, another performance. So it's happening. It's happening in the city. And so I encourage everyone to figure out what's going on and just go out and start supporting the arts as soon as possible.
Oh, thank you, Glenn. Lynn, I think you had something to add. We're at our time, so we're gonna have to close out, but you know, thank you to all of our panelists. We could continue this conversation. I know there were many questions from the audience, and I'm sure you know, we would be happy to respond to those via email. Of course, on that same note, Regina, you said it yourself, this is an opportunity for us to bring in people from other cities. Of course, you know where our loyalties lie here in the city of Dallas, but we do have a, SVP Dallas has a workshop, a response series event coming up, and it is next week. And so we're going to be talking to city managers from Dallas, you know, Austin, San Antonio. And so this is an opportunity for us to invite our other our Texan cities and, you know, family friends that may live in those areas. Once again, thank you to all the foundations who have worked together collectively and collaborating in those funding opportunities and working with different types of organizations. And of course, we thank our sponsors again, Something Good Consulting Group and Right Conatser. And of course, SVP Dallas, we're here to bring people together and bring pro bono consulting to organizations that might need it. And if you're a corporation that would like to support our efforts, we're also available to speak to you. And we have Big Bang coming up. And so you can visit bigbangtexas.com and buy your ticket there for a virtual event, a virtual conference. So thank you so much for your time, and we will see you next time, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.